All right. Well, hello everyone. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this event.
Just wait, we're not at 10. Okay, now it should start live streaming. So please start again.
Wonderful. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining for this event, wherever you are in the world. And please let us know in the chat of where you're logging in from and what you're looking forward to. My name is Patricia Gorky, and I'm honored to be here with you. I'm an activist and technology worker, and I co-hosted the podcast series Reading Capital with Comrades, which is why I'm especially glad to be here today to moderate today's symposium, clarifying the struggle for socialism on the uses and misuses of Marx's capital. Today, we're going to be hearing from a range of speakers on a range of applications of Marx's capital. Each talk is going to be about 10 to 12 minutes long, and we'll plan to keep this to about 2 to 2.5 hours. So if you have any questions, please either drop them in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll go through them at the end after we've had a chance to hear from the speakers. The event today is organized by the International Manifesto Group, a global institute representing a diversity of currents of socialist thought. And I'd like to encourage everyone to read and sign the International Manifesto that's published by the group on their website. The event is also organized by the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, a policy research institute, and the Critical Theory Workshop, an international school for transdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and committed research. This event is co-sponsored by the Radical Education Department, a militant research group whose members aim to produce historical material analyses on the contemporary world. Also by Peace, Land, and Bread, a peer-reviewed print journal of revolutionary theory, practice, and culture, and by the Hampton Institute, a working-class think tank that gives a platform to working-class theories, analyses, and commentary. And before we get started on the speakers, I just want to say a few words about why I'm also excited to be here to discuss Marx's Capital. So written more than 150 years ago, Marx's analysis and critique of capitalism laid bare this economic system that's driven by this insatiable appetite for ever greater profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. And friends, those environmental costs, those social costs are real. Of just the other day, an Antarctic ice shelf around the size of Rome has collapsed, and imperial war makers openly discuss military conflict with a nuclear power. And when we look at the jobs that exist in society, of what is happening in society, of what we have are some of the most educated people devoting to extracting ever more profit from us. Because to the capitalists, our existence as a class, as humanity, is just to produce wealth for them. They don't care about our families. They don't care about our communities and culture. What they care about is extracting ever more work from us to get ever more luxury and profit for them. And if we can't produce that wealth, if they can't extract increasing amounts of work from us, if we're too sick or too old or too infirm, then we're evicted from our homes, thrown in prisons, or tossed aside. There's only one choice for humanity today, and that's socialism. A system based on meeting people's needs with the common ownership of the productive forces of society and a planned sustainable economy. Of these aspects were elucidated through Marx's Capital more than 150 years ago. And we're here not because we despair, but because we know the urgency of the situation and the possibility of a better future. And fighting for socialism means that we have to understand capitalism. And there is no more potent theoretical weapon for us, the working class, than Marxism. So we're now going to go to our speakers. I'm going to introduce them one by one in the order that they'll speak. And after they speak, we'll go to the Q&A portion of today. So again, please put any questions that you have in the chat and use the Q&A function as well, and we'll get to those. So first, we'll hear from Radhika Desai. Radhika is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and the director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. She's the author of many books, including Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire, and editor and co-editor of many publications and books as well. Radhika's speech is titled History and Capital and History, and focuses on the centrality of contradiction in Marx's analysis of capital and how it's ignored by Marxist economists who have been trying to fit Marx into the anti-theatrical, methodological, and theoretical assumptions of neoclassical economics. So please welcome Radhika.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's really a great privilege to be here, and that was a really great introduction, and it leads right into what I have to say. So let me begin by saying that we live in a time of a military conflict that today appears to break into another Third World War. And it may seem to you as though capital, which is often regarded as a work about the capitalist economy, has nothing to say about it. But I would say that capital is about a society organized on a capitalist basis, and it has a great deal to say about it. It's about capitalist society. So my remarks are, as I say, I want to emphasize how central history is to capital. And I want to emphasize how contradiction is the motor of history, according to Marx, motor of capitalist history. And finally, I want to emphasize that this is being prevented from, we are being prevented from seeing this because of so much of what passes for Marxist economics. So let me start. Marx was the best hated and most calumniated man of his time, said Engels at his graveside. This was because Marx had discovered two things that struck at the heart of capitalism. As the latest form of oppressive social organization, it was neither natural nor eternal. It rested on entirely unnatural historical processes, forcibly or fraudulently separating the mass of humanity from its natural access to the means of production, leaving it dependent for employment by the appropriators of these means. Such a contradictory and antagonistic social order had to end. The question was only whether when it ended, it would take humanity with it. And that would depend on the choices humanity made. Secondly, Marx discovered the special laws of capitalism. Workers were exploited for surplus value. Capitalists and other property owners struggled over its distribution. Because capital does not have a global political economy, but a geopolitical economy in which states and their relations are central. And this also determines how contradictions become manifest in international competition and in imperialism, a reality whose workings we are seeing particularly up close and personal these days. The first volume of Capital is an exposition of the second discovery, and it rests on the first. Therefore, it is historical in two senses. In it, capitalism is historically specific, with a particular place in the past and future of humanity. And the contradictory dynamics of the struggles between and within classes and nations, these contradictions propel its turbulent and crisis-ridden history forward. And it shows that capitalism is made and can be unmade by social choices. That is why capitalism became part of the history of the capitalist world as no other book. European working class movements organized under its banner. While those movements failed their own internationalist and revolutionary vocations and scored their greatest successes through reform, beginning with the Russian Revolution, the ideas in capital informed a century-long series of revolutions. Preeminently, they inspired them, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and the Cuban. Today, as new generations experience capitalist crises, pestilence, we have even forgotten about the pandemic amid the wall-to-wall propaganda about the war, and war, of course. So as new generations live through social, cultural, political, and economic breakdown all around us, in the homelands of capitalism, Marx's legacy is nowhere to be seen. How can capital return to the history of these countries without shaking off the burden of Western interpretation of capital that has been accumulating for a century and a half, nearly crushing it? This cannot happen. And so lifting this burden involves rejecting more of our intellectual legacy, both mainstream and Marxist, than we imagine. Let me explain. Just 3 years after Capital appeared, the 1870 so-called Marginalist Revolution founded Neoclassical Economics, because Marx had resolved the key conundrums of classical political economy, conundrums such as what value is, where surplus value comes from, why crises occur, why the profit rate declines, how wages are determined. He resolved all these conundrums in the only way possible, by exposing capitalism's exploitative, crisis-ridden, and internationally aggressive character. As working classes became increasingly assertive, classical political economy, which Marx turned into a major weapon of critique, could no longer legitimize capitalism. Capitalism's ruling classes needed an alternative, and one arrived as if on cue, a systematization of what Marx had criticized, lambasted, and lampooned in Capital as vulgar economics, particularly in the section of the fetishism of commodities. So neoclassical economics was simply vulgar economics dressed up in theoretical guise. So today we know this as neoclassical economics. It narrowed the focus of analysis in comparison to classical political economy. It narrowed it to exchange, leaving out production, to prices, leaving out values, to the agency of individuals, leaving out classes. Its equilibrium assumptions left capitalism's contradictions and crises out. They can hardly be denied, but they were considered exogenous, striking capitalism from outside. Around such an economics, Max Weber, who people forget was originally trained as an economist, created a new social scientific division of labor, first hiving off sociology from economics. And he rested this, and of course, then the other disciplines emerged. And all this rested on Weber's claim that modern, that is capitalist societies, differentiate themselves into autonomous spheres, needing separate study. Of course, the economy's autonomy mattered most, permitting capitalists to keep control over the pace and pattern of economic growth, irrespective of performance, and therefore irrespective of the responsibility of addressing society's ills, society's material deprivations, and so on. Today, we perceive the problems with this organization of knowledge only dimly. Some people lament the separation of the social sciences and conjure with interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. But they overlook the greatest blow that was dealt by this new social scientific division of labor centered around neoclassical economics, that is the draining of history from the study of society. Marx's approach was historical. In it, organized human collectivities, classes, parties, states, made choices, acting in given inherited situations to drive history forward. In the new social sciences, social arrangements, the products of human historical decisions and actions, confront individual humans as laws to be obeyed, not changed. No wonder such social sciences couch everything in the simple present tense. Parties do this, governments do that, inflation does this, unemployment does that, forgetting that parties change over time. No two episodes of inflation or unemployment are the same, and the actions of historical agents change the terrain for the further unfolding of history. The capitalism of neoclassical economics and the rest of the social sciences that take their word for it is not only eternal, but also cosmopolitan. The historical work of necessarily national classes, parties, and states and economies in managing capitalism's contradictions through domestic and international action are written out of this script. Nothing could be farther from Capital. Capital showed how capitalism was distinguished from previous social forms of production by the production of abstract value. So capital is distinguished by producing not, tractors or trucks or bread or whatever, is distinguished by producing abstract value. And abstract value is the measure of labor embodied in its alienated products. The mechanisms of competition, by forcing technological improvement, push the value of these products down to the socially necessary level, improving social productivity and developing the forces of production. Unifying the two main types of capitalist contradictions, the interclass contradiction of exploitation, I sometimes call it the vertical contradiction, and the intra-class contradiction of competition between firms and between nationally organized blocks of capital. So through these, value production has lurched from crisis to crisis, experienced increasing legitimacy deficits, thanks to its anarchy through competition and its injustice through exploitation. Once economics eliminates value production as the historical distinctiveness of capitalism and its contradictory as well as progressive motor, we have ahistorical capitalism, stable, eternal, and unchanging. We lose the central plot that makes its tumultuous history intelligible. Such an intellectually impoverished understanding would have been no match for capital. However, Marxists themselves wield the Trojan horse of neoclassical economics into the Marxist citadel. Within a decade or so of the emergence of neoclassical economics, intellectuals coming over to Marxism and the working class were bringing their neoclassical training with them. Early immersion in neoclassical economics had its effect, and rather than rejecting it, they basically since then have been trying to fit Marxism into the antithetical, theoretical and methodological framework of neoclassical economics. This tendency was already at work in the Second International. Rosa Luxemburg battled its first incursions when she questioned her comrades' interpretation of the reproduction schemas of Volume 2 of Capital. And by the way, thanks to Derek, my interpretation of Volume 2 is on YouTube if you want to look for it. These problems also lay behind the Second International's Marxism becoming positivist. Today, this tendency has grown into a positively anti-Marxist Marxist economics, making absurd claims such as that capital suffers from a transformation problem. I have shown that it was Ricardo's problem, not Marx's. This transformation problem that you cannot translate prices into values. This is Ricardo's problem. They also make claims such as that capitalism does not suffer from deficits of consumption demand. Apparently, we are told Marx never said so. I have also refuted this in minute detail. And that the rate of profit does not fall, that Marx does not have that Marx has a commodity theory of money. All of these are fundamental misunderstandings of Marx, which you would not carry with you if you just read Volume 1. This list could go on. The rest of the Marxist social sciences, Marxist sociology, Marxist political science, etc., warn against economic determinism. However, they don't realize that it is only possible after economics is separated out from the rest of the social spheres. It is not separated out like that in capital. Today, these trends offer us the stunning spectacle of rockstar Marxist scholars who have taught capital for decades, telling us that there is no history in capital, but there is only history in capital. There is history in capital, and that is why capital has been part of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And again, just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat and the Q&A, and we'll go through those towards the end. So next, I'd like to introduce Gabriel Raquel. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He's the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He's published 9 books, numerous scholarly and journaling articles, and including most recently, Counter History of the Present. And for more information, you can follow his website as gabrielraquel.com. Gabriel's talk today is titled Anti-Communism and Western Marxism, the Case of the Frankfurt School. Gabriel will examine the historical relationship between one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry that presents itself as Marxist, namely the Frankfurt School, and actually existing socialism. By critically juxtaposing the works of figures like Adorno and Horkheimer to the Eastern Marxism manifest in the orientation of the Third International, Gabriel will situate the Frankfurt School's overt anti-communism more broadly within the international world war of ideas and the political economy undergirding it. Please welcome Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's a real honor to collaborate with so many powerhouse intellectuals and important theoretical and practical organizations, and I hope we'll have other opportunities to collaborate. My comments today will not be focused so much on capital per se, as on what Lenin referred to as the revolutionary core of Marxism, which of course is found in Capital, but also other works by Marx and Engels. and also then what became of this revolutionary core in what's referred to as Western or cultural Marxism. It's part of a larger research project entitled The Intellectual World War, the failed attempt to kill the very idea of communism. So the Frankfurt School and Frankfurt School critical theory has been, along with French theory, one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry. Together, they serve as the common source of so many of the trend-setting, globalized forms of theoretical critique that currently dominate the world market. The Frankfurt School's political orientation has therefore had a foundational effect on the Western intelligentsia and is situated at the very core of Western or cultural Marxism. What I would like to do here very briefly is recontextualize the Frankfurt School's work in relationship to the international class struggle, and in particular, the attempt, in the words of Cold War CIA agent Thomas Braden, to redefine the left as the compatible, meaning non-communist left, notably through the use of foundation money and the Central Intelligence Agency front groups such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which published Adorno in their journals and hosted Horkheimer at their conferences. Within this context, as we will see briefly, these two critical theorists, while offering some significant critiques of consumer society and the culture industry, were ultimately playing the role of radical recuperators. Cultivating an appearance of radicality, they recuperated the very activity of critique within a pro-Western, anti-communist ideology. Not unlike other members of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia in Europe, which formed the basis of Western Marxism, they were disgusted by the savage barbarians in the East who dared to take up the weapon of Marxist theory a la Lenin and use it to act on the principle that they could rule themselves. From the relative comforts of their professorial citadels in the West, financially supported by capitalist foundations and imperialist states, they defended the superiority of the Euro-American world that promoted them against the leveling project of the Bolshevized barbarians in the uncivilized periphery. My talk is going to kind of just jump through a few highlights in order to respect the time, so bear with me. So when Horkheimer took over the directorship of the Institute for Social Research in 1930, his stewardship was characterized by speculative concerns with culture and authority rather than rigorous historical materialist analyses of capitalism, class struggle, and imperialism. He refused and had taken a very specific position regarding the Institute to engage with direct political issues. This refusal intensified when the Institute moved to the United States in the early 30s. The Institute adapted itself to the local bourgeois order, censoring its own past and present work to suit local academic and corporate susceptibilities. Horkheimer literally had words like Marxism, revolution, and communism expunged from its publications in order to avoid offending its American sponsors. Furthermore, any type of political activity was forbidden. Horkheimer instead put his energy into securing corporate and state funding for the Institute, which he did very successfully, and he even hired a public relations firm to promote its work in the United States. Amongst the elements that are operative behind the support of the Frankfurt School, it is important to recognize that they decided after their sojourn in the United States to move back not to East Germany, but to West Germany. And in order to do that, they entered into one of the epicenters of the global class war against communism and received ample funding from the Rockefeller Foundation in particular in order to be at the forefront of this cultural war against actually existing socialism. Horkheimer continued his censorship of the Institute's work, refusing to publish 2 articles by no less than Jürgen Habermas, because they were critical of liberal democracy and spoke of revolution, daring to suggest the possibility of an emancipation from, quote, the shackles of bourgeois society, end quote. In his private correspondence, Horkheimer candidly submitted to an apparently sympathetic Adorno that, quote, it is simply not possible to have admissions of this sort in the research report of an institute that exists on the public funds of this shackling society, end quote. This appears to be a forthright admission that the economic base of the Frankfurt School was the driving force behind its ideology, or at least its public discourse. It is important to recall in this regard that 5 of the 8 members of the Horkheimer Circle had been employed by the US government and national security state, which had a vested interest in the continuing loyalty of the Frankfurt School because a number of its members were working on sensitive government projects. Adorno, after all, was brought to the United States originally to work on Paul Lazarsfeld's Office of Radio Research Project, which received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and worked very closely with the US national security state. In fact, 75% of its annual budget was made up of government money. The Rockefeller Foundation also funded Horkheimer's first return to Germany in 1948. And we should not forget that the Rockefellers are one of the greatest gangster families in the history of US capitalism, and they use their foundation as a tax shelter that allows them to mobilize a portion of their stolen wealth in the corruption of intellectual activity and culture. So with all of these ties to the capitalist ruling class in Western states, it should no wise surprise us that the US government supported the Frankfurt School's move back to West Germany with a very significant grant that amounts to over $1 million in 2022 dollars. The Institute also received support from private donors, the Society of Social Research, the City of Frankfurt, and it even signed a research contract with the Mannesmann Corporation that had been a founding member of the Anti-Bolshevik League and had financed the Nazi Party. One of the elements of the research that they did for this Nazi collaborating company was a sociological study of workers' opinions, with the implicit implication that such a study would help management stall or prevent socialist organizing. Shepard Stone, I think, most clearly identified the role that the Frankfurt School played for the corporatocracy in the US national security state. He was a director of international affairs for the Ford Foundation, where he oversaw their close work with the Central Intelligence Agency on numerous cultural and intellectual projects. And he sent a personal note to the State Department in the 1940s to encourage them to extend Adorno's passport, where he said the Institute for Frankfurt is helping to train German leaders who will know something of democratic techniques. I believe it is important for our overall democratic objectives in Germany that such men as Professor Adorno have an opportunity to work in that country, end quote. The Institute was doing the kind of ideological work that the US state and capitalist ruling class wanted and did support. Meeting and even surpassing the dictates of ideological conformity of the shackling society that funded the Institute, Horkheimer openly expressed his fulsome support for the US anti-imperialist puppet government in West Germany, anti-communist puppet government in West Germany, whose intelligence services had been stocked with former Nazis, as well as its imperial project in Vietnam. Horkheimer is on record as claiming, quote, "In America, when it is necessary to conduct a war, and now listen to me, it is not so much a question of the defense of the homeland, but it is essentially a matter of the defense of the Constitution, the defense of the rights of man," end quote. Now, Adorno occasionally shirked in the political shadows, but in 1956, he supported, along with Horkheimer, the imperialist invasion of Egypt by Israel, Britain, and France, which aimed at seizing the Suez Canal and overthrowing Nasser. They referred to Nasser as a, quote, "fascist chieftain who conspires with Moscow," and exclaimed, quote, "No one even ventures to point out that these Arab robber states have been on the lookout for years for an opportunity to fall upon Israel and to slaughter the Jews who have found refuge there," end quote. So according to this pseudo-dialectical inversion, it is the Arab robber states, not the settler colony working with poor imperialist countries, that is fascist. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer published one of their most overt political texts the same year in '56. Rather than supporting the global movement for anti-colonial liberation and the building of a socialist world, they celebrate, with only a few minor exceptions, the superiority of the Western world while repeatedly disparaging the Soviet Union and China. Invoking stock racist descriptions of the barbarians in the East, these are their words, whom they describe as fascists who have chosen slavery. Adorno even chastises Germans who mistakenly think that, quote, "the Russians stand for socialism," reminding them that the Russians are actually fascists, adding that the industrialists and bankers already know this, undoubtedly due to the threat posed by communism to their property interests. I believe, Horkheimer averred in a world historical conclusion that provoked no rebuttal on the part of his closest collaborator, that Europe and America are probably the best civilizations that history has produced up to now as far as prosperity and justice are concerned. The key point now is to ensure the preservation of these gains. Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, also supported quite resolutely the quote unquote totalitarian equivalence between fascism and communism. If this equivalence manifests itself in socialist state building projects, anti-colonial movements, or even new left mobilizations in the Western world. In all three cases, those who think they are breaking out of the shackling society of bourgeois society are only making things worse, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. Our philosophy, they write, and here I'm arriving soon at my conclusion, as a dialectical critique of the overall social tendency of the age, stands in the sharpest opposition to the politics and doctrine that emanates from the Soviet Union. We are unable to see anything in the practice of the military dictatorships disguised as people's democracies other than a new form of repression. Adorno doubled down on this and also added China as a reference point and said that he would have to go back on everything he's ever thought if he were to support anything that he sees in China and hence by extension in these Eastern Marxist movements that were changing the world, not simply interpreting it. So a final conclusion is the following. So the goal of this very brief analysis, which is part of a larger project, is not simply to demonstrate that Adorno and Horkheimer were on the wrong side of history, defending capitalist countries and their imperialist endeavors over and against the socialist world. It is rather to situate their work within the political economy of ideas by elucidating the relationship between their research and the intellectual apparatus that structured it. By intellectual apparatus, I mean the material system of production, circulation, and reception that forms an important part of the superstructure. As we have seen, they were amply funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class and imperialist states, including the Central Intelligence Agency of the US National Security State, which provided them with comfortable lifestyles and promoted their research as the most radical work on offer, precisely because they rejected as beyond the pale actually existing socialism and the entire tradition of revolutionary socialism. Far from being Marxists in the anti-revisionist sense, they were radical recuperators within the capitalist intellectual apparatus. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And again, we'll have time for questions and comments afterwards. Next, I'd like to introduce Derek Ford. Derek is an assistant professor of education studies at DePauw University and an instructor with the People's Forum. They teach and research about how pedagogical theory can advance political struggles. He is the author of 7 monographs, the latest of which are Encountering Education, Elements for Marxist Pedagogy. Derek's popular writing has appeared in outlets such as Monthly Review and Black Agenda Report. They are the editor of Liberation School and the education department chair at the Hampton Institute, a working class think tank. And they recently led and narrated the podcast series, Reading Capital with Comrades. Derek's speech is titled The Complexity of Time, History, Revolution, and the Future in Marx's Capital. Their speech focuses on those who misread Marx's Capital as a Eurocentric work that universalizes and totalizes history into a linear and progressive narrative. They demonstrate how colonialism was central to Capital and how Capital and Marx's work not only articulated the intimate connections between workers' movements and the struggles against slavery and colonialism, but also how it never assumed that history was linear or progressive or stagist, nor did it universalize any English story onto the whole world. So please welcome Derek.
Thank you so much, comrades. And it's really great to be here. And if there's any problems with my audio or video, just let me know because my connection might not be very secure. So yeah, first, I wanted to thank everybody and just also note like the wide variety of organizations and institutions and individuals who are behind this webinar. I think it's really, quite indicative of really a sea change that we can be a part of in terms of moving intellectual thought out of the academy and back into the actual popular movements. And in particular, differentiating academics from intellectuals, because we know that they are not the same. So, just to pick up on where Gabriel left off, I think in my own field, critical pedagogy, the actual field, critical pedagogy, originated, as Karim Malat showed, as an anti-communist break in the early 1980s. Paulo Freire never talked about his work as being critical pedagogy. North Americans took up his work and made it into critical pedagogy and basically established their credentials on these very anti-Marxist themes that Gabriel was talking about. And then my comments also, I think, build on Radica's insistence that capital is not merely a work of theory, but also a work of history, and that those two things aren't separable. So to begin, I think, I was actually reading Frederick Jameson's early work in the 1980s about cognitive mapping. And, he says that the real crisis of Marxism at the time is really a crisis in ideology, in the sense that ideology is something that grips the masses and shows them a potential different future as possible. And at the time, importantly, he said that Cuba and Yugoslavia were some of those countries that were providing that ideological hope. But that's just sort of an aside. So our task today as socialists in the United States and in North America is, it is greater in some respects than the historical task, because it's not about the setbacks the movement has endured, because setbacks are much more frequent than victories. It's really an ideological struggle in that the ideological continuity that marked the workers' movements for a century has really been broken, so that Marxism has become just sort of one pole or one theory amongst a plethora of others in academia from which we can sort of take things and whatever. And as a result, there's a lot of misunderstandings. And I don't blame the people, who propagate these, because oftentimes it just comes from not reading Capital itself. It comes from reading comments on Capital. And so I think that's why it's so important to read the book and to read it collectively. And I noticed that, the very first sentence of Capital, Marx says that the wealth of the wealth in those societies in which the capitalist production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. Many people are interested in how it presents itself as that, which means it isn't that. But what I'm interested in is when Marx says that the capitalist mode of production prevails. He doesn't say it's exclusive. He doesn't say it's obliterated all other modes of production. And this is really important. When you go to the index of the International Publishers Edition of Capital to mode of production, there's nothing there. It instead points you to socioeconomic formations. And this distinction, I think, is very key, because all social formations are combinations of different modes of production, some that are sort of ascending, some that are descending, but they're all locked in struggle with each other. And so, the historical sense that we get from that is not one in which one stage supersedes the next stage to replace it in a sort of linear developmental process, but one in which, the past and the future and the present are sort of heterogeneously blocked together. And the distinction between social formation and modes of production is crucial, because it acknowledges that there's different kinds of time, different spatial arrangements in any given society. And so, Marx justifies his analysis of capitalism based primarily on England in the first foreword to the first edition of Capital, because it's where capitalism was most advanced, and so where its logic was most easily sort of abstractable. But even in this advanced state, he says, England suffered from, quote, a whole series of inherited evils arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, with their inevitable train of social and political anachronism, together with the modern evils of capitalism. So if readers in other places disregard the book as a result, he says, they miss what Capital's logic might do to their own countries. And so he explicitly states that the different levels of capitalism in different regions isn't a question of the higher or lower degree of development of the social antagonism, but because what's at issues are the laws themselves, which are going to be, as he constantly reminds us, adjusted in their actual operation. And so in the last part of Capital, Volume 1, to give just one example, he provides the key to deciphering why capital was so advanced in England. And it had nothing to do with what was happening in England. It had to do with the fact that England was the center of world colonialism. Capitalism was advanced in England because of, among other things, as he wrote, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, national and international debts, the discovery of gold and silver, their extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of Black people, and slavery, pure and simple, in the United States. So this is what makes England so advanced capitalistically. is because of its role in colonialism and slavery and genocide and so on and so forth. And then the very last chapter, of course, is about colonialism, right? And I think that's really what allows Marx to then open up his entire theoretical analysis apparatus and all the inquiry that he's done into a new state, right? Where, like these things aren't just going to be resolved because they can take on different forms through colonialism. And of course, in volume 3, Marx writes that colonialism is one of the countervailing tendencies to the rate of profit to fall, which I believe Alan will be talking about later on. So throughout Capital, Marx articulates how such uneven combinations of time produce the time of capitalist economic production that's constructed out of the reality of these different rhythms, right? So there's the rhythms of necessary and surplus labor, the turnover of various components of capital, the aggregate of the total social capital, the biological times, the social times of living beings, of labor power, transportation, finance capital, none of which can be read immediately in the flow of any given process. So there's no uniform, continuous, and permanent time that operates from the Earth's genesis until now, or from capital's genesis until now. The idea in our experience of time is the product of capital. And so one political task that pedagogy for me assumes is the knowledge and the sensation of the different kinds of times and modes of production that are present in the present, right? That enable us to connect our current conjuncture with the ongoing developments of the class struggle and to really perceive the possibility and the actuality of revolution. And so Harry Haroutunian has a thesis that basically a lot of this comes from certain Western Marxists' take on formal versus real subsumption as a historical account rather than as an analytical model. So how am I doing on time, Patricia?
You got 4 more minutes.
Okay, great. So formal subsumption or subjection is when capital takes, the production process as it finds it, prolongates the working day. And then real subjection or real subsumption is when capital modifies that process, primarily by taking the knowledge and skills from the workers themselves and putting them into machinery. And so, but Marx is using this as an analytical model, not as a historical, analytic to understand the passage of time. And so this is why I've always preferred the translation of the international publishers, which is subjection to subsumption, because subjection allows for some autonomy of different modes of production, different temporalities, and so on and so forth. And so, Harry Haroutunian's argument is really because Marx saw capitalism as hosting such a vast heterogeneous inventory of times that that's what made it precisely so effective. And nothing reveals this more really than Marx's openness to his suggestion that the surviving communes in 19th century Russia are progressive relative to capitalism. And even in the Grundrisse notebooks, the late 1850s, Marx rejected any linear causality that envisioned a singularly progressive movement from one period of production to the next. Sometimes this comes about as, there's sort of didactic context in which they were writing, right? Which is why Marx and Engels stressed the economic aspects of the base and the superstructure, because they were writing against those who would deny that, right? And so here's the other thing is that, and I'll close with this, is that the sense in which Marx said he wasn't a Marxist, if we're to believe Engels, isn't because he, didn't like the label per se, but because it wasn't his thought. It was the thought of the international working class movement. And so the theory that he develops isn't the theory of Marx, it's the theory of the working class struggle. And so we can see this in various points, especially in volume 1. Take the chapter 10 on the working day, when Marx has constructed this, theoretical apparatus based on capital's own laws, and then he brings it to its limit, right? Where between equal rights, force decides. And what he's saying is that this theory can't be solved in theory. It's only solved in practice. And he's opening it up to political struggle because that's what advances theory. And so I think, obviously, another one is the section on primitive accumulation, right? And nowhere in that section does Marx say this is the story, this is the story of everything, this is how it's going to be, and so on and so forth. It's really the fact that knowledge doesn't produce politics, politics produces knowledge. And so for those of us in the United States trying to build the socialist movement, socialism is popular. What we have to do is we have to give definition and precision to socialism. And part of that means correcting against the misinterpretations of Marxism, especially those that are used to divide the Marxist struggle from the indigenous struggle, from the struggles of other oppressed identities and nationalities in the United States and globally. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Derek. So now I would like to introduce Megha Summer Papachen. Summer is a PhD student of comparative politics and political theory at Northwestern University. She's an organizer in Chicago with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and she's engaged in struggles around police brutality, gentrification, and anti-imperialism. Her research is grounded in Marxist and feminist theory, social reproduction theory, post-colonial and queer theory, and the history of the global South. And she's written for Liberation School and Breaking the Chains magazine. Summer's speech is titled, "Did Marx Forget About the Woman? Housework and Reproduction in Marx's Capital." And it's about the invisible role that housework plays in the capitalist system. She brings to the fore the many ways in which capital offers a framework to carefully theorize reproductive work, such as raising children, cleaning bathrooms, cooking dinner, emotional labor, sexual labor, and so on. Work which is overwhelmingly performed by working women all around the world. And she adopts an internationalist perspective when imagining the woman, and argues that Marx helped us understand the full scale of a woman's economic contributions to capitalism. And not only that, but he also enabled generations of women to understand our contribution to the revolution, which will ultimately overthrow capital, the very source of our double exploitation. Please welcome Summer.
Thank you, Patricia. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Summer, and my talk today is about something that's very close to my own life, and that is probably close to literally everyone's life on this call, because it's about social reproduction. And when Marxists say social reproduction, we are referring to the hours and hours and hours of time that working people around the world spend in their homes performing essential labor that is unpaid, but also completely necessary to our employers and to capitalism at large, but also just to humanity. This work includes cooking dinner, cleaning after cooking dinner, washing bathrooms, showering, getting ready, putting on makeup for some people. But it also, most importantly, probably includes raising children and all that goes into that emotionally and physically every day. For a lot of people, social reproduction also means nursing yourself when you're sick, or caring after elderly or disabled family members, younger siblings, when you yourself might be at a young age. So it covers and names a really big part of the lives of working people around the world. And it essentially is its definition would be everything that goes into replenishing a worker's basic needs so that they can arrive to work the next day and basically replenish their labor power, to use Marxist terms for that. And when it comes to social reproduction as a category, before I get into the actual talk, it also includes things that are outside of the home, of course, like education and the transportation industry that help you get from one place to another. But the thing about housework and domestic work specifically is that it is so isolated to individual private homes and is so gendered and also invisible, because it is never thought of as labor by the capitalist government or culture in general. So, like I said, this work is really gendered, and that's something I'm centering in our talk today, because as wives, mothers, daughter-in-laws, and sisters, it's normal for proletarian women to not only go outside in the day and work and earn a wage, but then to come back home and start a second shift, is how it's often called. So the point I want to make is not just that this is so bad and so exploitative, but that there's also a history here. And it is a history of the origin of class society that predates capitalism and predates feudalism. And it's a history that was also formed in step with the invention or the origin of the oppression of women, which hasn't actually always been around, right? It's not a natural feature of humans that women are subjugated, right? It is a feature of specifically of class society, and capitalism is just one of the iterations of that. So my talk will also really focus on how the book Capital gives us a crucial framework to even begin to understand our lives in our homes. In Capital, Marx centers the relationship between production and reproduction in his explanation of how capitalism works and how surplus value is generated. And so by putting social reproduction, everything I mentioned just now, right? Cooking, cleaning, looking after kids, by putting social reproduction at the heart of its analysis, Capital was likely one of the first and only books to so thoroughly center women's often invisible labor in its explanation of how politics and economics work. Now, not many people actually think that when you're in academic spaces, and that's a big part of my motivation for writing this talk, because Marx gets a lot of criticism, and just Marxists in general get a lot of criticism, specifically from the academy, about perpetuating sexist and racist assumptions, even while maybe espousing liberatory doctrines, or that's the accusation. Marx is accused of overlooking the woman worker or the racialized worker's experience because he maybe centers the male proletariat factory worker. And as people interested in this stuff, we've probably heard that before. And as we'll see in a moment, these critiques are dumbfounding because they're based on nothing, as Derek was saying. And if I'm being honest, I too held these critiques of Marx in the past, maybe when I was an undergrad, specifically when I was writing my senior thesis on this very topic, mainly because I didn't actually closely read Capital. But now that I have, one really finds that by studying Marx's words, as we will do a little bit in this talk, in addition to not only Marx's words, but also the long tradition of folks who have continued to deepen and extend his analysis, we see that Marxism is the only tradition that is serious about understanding the full reality of working women's lives, and is the only analysis that can actually lead us and guide us to real material women's liberation. So one of the first things that we learn when it comes to studying social reproduction from a Marxist perspective is that the family is a site of economic activity and exploitation. So the family in itself is an economic unit. And that's something that Marx and Engels revealed to us early on in their work. So the word, for example, family in itself comes from the Latin word familia, which translates to the total number of slaves belonging to one man. And it also comes from the word familus, which literally translates to domestic slave. So Marx used this language of comparing the wife's status within the house to being that of a domestic slave in Capital. Volume 1 is he writes that, I'm going to quote it, previously, the worker sold his own labor power, which he disposed of as a free agent, formally speaking. Now he sells his wife and child. He has become a slave dealer, end quote. So here Marx is talking in the context of how when women entered the workforce, they would earn a wage, of course, but that wage was taken by their husband, who then becomes no less than a slave dealer, specifically in economic terms. And Marx and Engels also are known for critiquing the institution of marriage, specifically because of the effect it has on women, making them isolated into homes, producing nothing but dusted couches and clean floors. For example, they write that, quote, the bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production and nothing more. So basically there's a history of how we got here. And I recommend, of course, that everyone read The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, because I could never do it justice. But In it, Engels documents how the emergence of private property created classes long ago, before even feudalism existed. So the emergence of private property created classes out of what was previously collective, indigenous, more communal communities that were also maternally organized. But due to certain material conditions, surplus goods were created for the first time, and men seized upon that surplus and made it private property. They overthrew the mother right in order to control and maintain property within the father's line. And this is called the world historical defeat of the female sex, at least by Engels. But it's not just in this history that we see the Marxist canon pay attention to women's exploitation, but the very core analysis in Capital centers reproduction in a crucial way. So Marx was the one who said that reproduction is the reason that labor exists, and then labor is the reason that value and profit exist in society. Chapter 6, for example, lays out how the value of labor power has to be daily produced by cooking, cleaning, and by consuming goods so that a worker can reproduce himself. But the thing is that when you read these passages, Marx is not writing in a vocabulary of cultural or feminist studies. And I think that's key because he's not using phrases and terms that would typically remind us of feminism from an academic standpoint or intellectual standpoint. And yet, Capital, I would say, offers a much deeper skeletal infrastructure that is needed to conduct any study of working women's lives, specifically when it comes to unpaid domestic work. And that's because we need to understand unpaid domestic work in a context of history, of the rise of class society, and of capitalism, and why this work is not only necessary, but also made invisible in this weirdly deliberate way. And this is also why struggles have for a long time drawn on Marxism to make unpaid labor visible for reproductive justice struggles in a capitalistic society that is insistent upon undervaluing it. I'll wrap up now by suggesting some possible solutions that people, when they think about the crisis of social reproduction support, there's three. So the first one I want to talk about is sharing the labor more equally amongst maybe a husband and wife or two partners or just a family. The second one is something perhaps some people have heard of or perhaps not, which is the wages for housework movement. And then the last one is industrializing and socializing housework. So many of us can probably relate to the call for households to more equally divide the workload. So specifically relieving women, right, of the overwhelming burden of reproducing all the workers in the house, including herself, most likely. And of course, I support this call because relief is important and because of the principle of equality. However, that sharing housework in itself can never be a complete solution. And that's because of the realities of the hardships that working families face. There are people with disabilities, older people who live alone, and families that are simply too overburdened and exploited to have that be a sustainable solution for all of society. I mean, many of us grew up in chaotic households like that. So more is needed. And a second solution people often offer is, or suggest, is the wages for housework movement. And that's something everyone should Google because it has a very interesting history in which women, starting, I believe, in Italy, argued that women who perform housework or raise children should be paid a wage for their contributions to capitalism. How exactly that would work is debated, but the key would be including housework into formal labor relations from which it has always been kept invisible. And now, while there are progressive elements to this call, it can never be the extent of the solution because upon interviewing working women, it becomes pretty clear pretty fast that women don't want to be tied and isolated to the home forever and now get paid a wage for it. It would simply codify and legalize an exploitation that's already ongoing. So then I'll just end on a revolutionary solution that comrades, Marxist women have supported for a long time, and that is the socialization of housework. Angela Davis called it the abolition of housework. And that's because it's the abolition of housework as we know it, right? As being something that each family has to fend for themselves, fight to live, to see another day, to put dinner on the table and fund all of this. So socialization would mean that society and the state is responsible for its people and meeting their basic needs rather than the, I guess, leading mother or leading woman or individuals in each family to be responsible for. So this call recognizes the need for the state and society to take on the burden of housework and to not leave individual families to fend for themselves. It will look like cooking, cleaning, and laundry be taken out of the home and become the responsibility of organizations and associations of workers. And I just want to end on a quote because when I was doing my senior thesis a couple years ago, which is the project that got me interested in, or that the project in which I guess I expressed my interest in this topic, I had the privilege of interviewing some comrades here in our branch here in Chicago. And when I asked one of the comrades who is a young worker and an organizer with us, when I asked them about what this industrialization would look like, right? Because it is a very foreign concept to most. This is what they said, and then I'll be done. They said, I mean, it's always hard to imagine what it is going to look like after capitalism, because who knows about the exact conditions and everything. But when I think about it, like personally, from that perspective, I think a lot more things should be public or organized in the interest of the public, instead of so much falling to individual families. I'm thinking more communal minded when it comes to childcare and stuff. That it's not just a family unit, the nuclear family that is alone responsible for making sure everything is running, but that there is a lot more support coming from the state or from your neighborhood or maybe your local community. Making sure that everyone has a cooked meal every day. That's one thing I personally like the idea of, is having communal kitchens. Just having options that you could do it on your own if you like, but a more effective way would always be possible for people to do it together. So that's the end of that. But here, my comrade, I think really helps us to begin to visualize and imagine what a solution like this could look like. But it is a solution that would have to come hand in hand with a much deeper transformation of society, could come hand in hand with the abolition of capitalism and the establishment and defense of a state that really does prioritize and center working people's basic needs. And it is a world we would have to fight for. And I'll end on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Summer. Thank you for that. So now we are going to move on to our last speaker for today, Alan Freeman. Alan is a co-director with Radhika Desai of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, GERG, at the University of Manitoba. Alan was an economist at the Greater London Authority between 2000 and 2011, where he held the brief for the creative industries and the living wage. He wrote The Benn Heresy, a biography of British politician Tony Benn, and co-edited 3 books on value theory. Alan's talk is Marx, the Falling Profit Rate and the Critics, New Evidence, and presents a mass of new evidence on the course of the rate of profit since the last war. It will assess what this means both for our understanding of capitalism and the causes of its multiple current and acute and chronic economic and political crises, and for our evaluation of Marxist theory. It will comment on the light this sheds on the multiple criticisms of Marxist theory, which still dominates Marxist scholarship to this day. And above all, that interpretation of Marx, which TSSI scholars term Marxism without Marx.
I'm hoping you can all see my screen. Is that working okay? I'm going to try and see what happens if I start the slideshow. Can you still see it? That's good. So I, after much thought, deliberately entitled this Theses on the Warfare State, which is a riff on theses on Feuerbach, and the point, however, is to change it, and a riff on welfare state, because my argument is that the warfare state is the way that one should characterize the formation that we know as the US of A. I've put a link in the chat in which I quote this very long text, which I was very interested because when TSSI began, I wrote a chapter somewhat bombastically entitled The Psychopathology of Balrasian Marxism. But the quote is how I phrased it at the time, why you need to understand Marx and why Marx is so hated. Now, I'm not going to read that out, but if you follow the link in the chat, you'll find both my slides and that long quote. So I'm going to begin with something that I call the Great Northern Decline. And what you see here is a graph of the average growth rate of the entire global north. That's the USA, Europe, Japan, and the settler colonies. This has actually been declining since 1951. And the extraordinary thing is, nobody has noticed. But this is what lies behind the current crisis of the global order that the imperialist countries have created. It involves all countries of the North since 1974. Before 1974, the German, Japanese, and Spanish economies were catching up. After 1974, which Mandel called the second slump, history basically took a completely new turn, which we'll look at, and these countries basically merged with all the rest. This is the longest decline in the history of capitalism. It's actually a new historical event of supreme importance. And it is entirely endogenous. That means it's generated from within capitalism. It's not caused by China. It's not caused by the trade unions. It's not caused by terrorists, not caused by monetary management. It's caused by capitalism itself. It's what capitalism does to itself. Now, value theory actually explains this. Marx's value theory, but also many elements of value theory that preceded Marx, which is why I'm systematically going to speak of value theory. But of course, Marx, we know, was the most, coordinated and up-to-date and comprehensive interpretation of that. So actually, Keynes understood some of this. So why is it ignored? And I think another little bit of bombast I'm calling the doctrine of market perfection. I want to speak of the material basis of stupidity, and that's very conscious. Conscious word, it's not bombast actually. Marx's theory presents an obvious explanation for these facts. I'll give it to you in 12 minutes. The real puzzle is, why is that explanation ignored? And the answer, I think, is it arises from what I call imperial hubris. This is a prejudice, the prejudice that the capitalist system is superior to all others. I think Gabriel explained very well the way that worked its way into the Frankfurt School, but it's quite universal. And among Marxists, sadly, or at least Western Marxists, it's expressed in what Radica and I call capital worship. The idea that capitalism is so amazing, we have to theorize it by constructing a Platonic form. We have to study it in its perfect form, which is general equilibrium, which means we assume from the outset that the market is perfect. And that works its way in a lot of obscure mathematics. But the key thing is to grasp the thesis itself. And once you do that, you've hermetically sealed economics against understanding why this sort of thing is happening. It's actually impossible. You'll have heard perhaps of something called the Accumulation theorem. This is on a false interpretation of Marx, which unfortunately is generalized in the Western world. Actually proved that if you hold that interpretation of Marx, the falling rate of profit, which is what I'm going to say is the cause, is impossible. So let's turn from the North as a whole to the US, because that's the example I'm going to concentrate on. This has also declined secularly since 1950. There is a difference with the North as a whole, which is that there was a little recession, a big recession in 1956 post-Korea, which was not shared by Germany, Spain, and Japan. And that's why you don't see that blip in the North as a whole. But otherwise, it's basically the same. So economic commentators, what they do is they only study the ups and downs, the cyclic variations. Every crash is a surprise, and every boom is a confirmation of the triumphant character of capitalism. And that's because when they don't look at the trend, because the trend does not confirm their prejudice. And as Radek has pointed out many times, because they don't look at history, they don't study the economy historically. But actually, I don't know if you can see this, I hope you can, but the trough, the peak of the part of the cycle we've just passed through is lower than the trough of all the post-war booms, of all the post-war cycles. So historically, we are at the lowest, one of the lowest points ever. And the latest data from 2021, which was trumpeted as, you know, great US recovery, all you have to do is take a 4-year moving average, and it's absolutely clear that there's nothing like a recovery from what's going on. So what does this have to do with the profit rate? Well, this is a graph of the one graph of the profit rate, because there are many ways of talking about it. There's a lot of controversy about it, and they arise because writers like Duménil and Levy argue that neoliberalism rescued capitalism and restored the profit rate. One of the things I'm going to show is that this isn't so. Even then, there's no disputing this tremendous fall from 1939 to 1974. Now we have new evidence using capital stock data supplied by the Penn World Tables. You have to dig, but you know, being a statistician, I've dug. And I don't think this has been shown anywhere else. This is the maximum profit rate. That's the highest profit rate you can have, because we don't have good data for wages yet, or the operating surplus. The maximum possible profit rate, but it's a good proxy for the profit rate, because wage variations hardly affect the rate of profit at all. I've written something showing that for the USA. You know, this is not the countervailing tendency that overrides the profit rate. So we use the maximum profit rate. There's a remarkably uniform downward trend. And we find this in all countries of the global north. This is the trend in what I call Colonia, the United States, Canada, and Australia. I've missed out poor little New Zealand, but there's no difference there. The East Asian tigers, this is the profit rate in the East Asian tigers, the miracle countries that were going to save capitalism from its decline. No difference throughout the global north. Why is the profit rate relevant? I mean, there's a lot of it's still coming out. David Harvey is still writing stuff saying the profit rate has no effect on the economy at all. I feel like saying it's investment dummy. In a capitalist system, what is done with profits is to pursue the highest possible rate of profit, surplus profit. That's the central concept of Marx's Capital, which only Mandel has really drawn out at great length. And I urge everybody who can to read his wonderful 1974 book, not Marx's Political Economy, but the one on late capitalism, where he develops this theory of the use of surplus profit very, very clearly. Capitalism everywhere, capitalists don't look for the average rate of profit, they look for the highest. So the profit is the driver of investment. So all I've done here is I've drawn two graphs, one of investment and one of GDP growth next to the other. And you can see that the decline in GDP growth is tracked by the decline in investment. Investment, the failure of investment, or as Andrew Kleiman calls it, the failure of production, is the cause of the decline. It's unavoidable conclusion. And this again is true for all countries of the global north. Here's the European majors on the left, share of investment in GDP. Here's Japan's catastrophic decline. And here's the US share of net private investment in profits. And I was able to calculate as a share of profits for the US, but not for the other countries. That's very important because it tells you what the capitalists are doing with their money. And what they're doing with their money since 1974 is instead of investing it in production, they are buying financial assets. This is the US share of financial assets in total private assets. So as the profit rate in production goes down, it becomes more and more attractive to buy monetary instruments. Actually, Marx and Keynes both understood this, which is why they rejected Say's law. they argue that financial accumulation is antithetical to real accumulation. You cannot grow your economy by growing your banks or your stock markets. And the reason is because of money. Very basic point that Marx makes right at the beginning, that Keynes marks. It's commodities do not exchange for commodities. They exchange for money, CMC. So the capitalists don't actually have to spend their surplus on anything at all. They can simply hold on to the money. Now, what's happened with the arrival of the mass credit markets that came in from about 1974 onwards is they began to spend it on financial assets. The response of capitalism to the 1974 second slump was to stop buying real assets and buy financial instruments instead. Now, there's a school, the financialization school, that says financialization is responsible for the problems that capitalism has. There's a lot of truth in that, but the question that must be asked is, what's responsible for financialization? And the answer is, folks, the declining rate of profit, the much maligned, horrible, fundamentalist declining rate of profit. So financialization is not the primary cause of crisis. It's an outcome of the primary cause, which is the falling profit rate. And this also demonstrates the flaw in Harvey's argument and many others who say, why should the falling profit rate lead to falling investment? The mechanism is through financialization. Now, I'm coming up to the end because I want to make a very important point that Andrew Kleiman, myself, and Nick Potts made in a response to Michael Heinrich, in which Michael treated Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit as a prediction. And there are Marxists who do that, good people who I like, but it wasn't a prediction. It's an explanation. Something's happening, and this is what science is. Like, you see the sun go up, and the theory of gravity tells you why. It doesn't mean that the law of gravity doesn't say everything always falls all the time. It's a necessary part of a comprehensive explanation. So it's not a prediction, and the profit rate does not fall all the time. The question is a historical question: when does it not fall? And we have to ask something very simple: when did the US profit rate recover, and why? It recovered during the war. This is the US share of public investment in the total. It was 85% of all investment at the peak of the war was undertaken by the state. They took the investment process out of the hands of private investors, and they were able to do it by using the war to override capitalist resistance to state investment and to prevent the working class taking advantage of it, which is the big risk of allowing the state to become involved. And you see that there's always a big wave of radicalization in all countries after each war, because there are war measures introduced in which big concessions are made to the workers, and the workers after the war say, well, let's keep on, folks. We really liked rationing. The UK working class was fantastically enthusiastic about rationing for 5 years until it was demolished finally by Macmillan and people like that. So it overcomes the difficulty of the working class taking advantage of it. It then rebuilt US capital stock from the ground up. And the project was that the US was going to become the dominant world power and the supplier of war material to the imperialist powers as a whole, which is why I call it the warfare state, because the economy was reconstructed as the supplier of means of war to the world. Even then, they had to work hard to put the working class genie back in the bottle. So they had to embark on McCarthyism, the Cold War, and all that stuff to crush the incipient working class. Response, opportunistically taking advantage of it. So the result is a unique capitalist formation, a warfare state. Now, how am I doing for time? Shall I stop or shall I? Patricia's.
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, what the project is that I think is necessary to arise out of this, it's not just the rescue of Marx, it's the rescue of economics. What we have to understand is that the suppression of Marx's economics at the hands of the Marxists is only one aspect of the conversion of economics. It's regulatory capture by the financial, basically by state financial power, and its conversion into a doctrinaire religion ruled by the doctrine of market perfection. So if you want an alternative, this has to be market-free, which is a riff on free market, just simply turning it around. And I think this cannot be done if professional economics as it is continues to exist. What we need is a generalized economic literacy. It's part of what socialism needs to actually provide and work for, is generalize the understanding of how capitalist societies work. And that's not particularly difficult. Then we can situate what is the attack on Marx. It's a denial of rational thinking about economics. It's the attempt to replace a scientific understanding, a theory that explains what we see, with a religious and doctrinal view, which doesn't actually take any account of reality and is replaced by the assumption that the market is perfect. Then there's I put in a heap of references, and if you want to see them, just go to the URL that I posted, which is also the where my academia site is. So thank you very much to everybody for listening to this somewhat dry topic of Marx's economics, and I hope it was of some use.
Thank you, Alan, for that fascinating topic. For one, I had never seen the growth rate, and that was actually pretty shocking of realizing that yes, the growth rate has actually fallen. So I think it was incredibly rich and not dry as all, as many people are saying. And so we're now going to go into the question and answer session. Before we do that, well, just a couple things. So if you have any questions, please feel free, put them in the Q&A, put them in the chat. If you'd like a particular panelist to respond to, if there's a particular aspect or if it's general, please indicate. Otherwise, we'll make our inferences and put this out to the panelists. And before we get to the Q&A, would like to just take a moment to allow the organizers of this event to speak as well, of International Manifesto Group, the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and the Critical Theory Workshop. And so why don't we start, perhaps, Radhika, if you could speak and just explain a bit about the International Manifesto Group.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to put the URL of the International Manifesto Group in the chat. I've just done it. And I just want to say very briefly that it's an international discussion group, really, or left-oriented anti-imperialist, that got together during the pandemic in order to try to understand the very fast-paced changes, both in different parts of the world, domestically and internationally, that were taking place, and we tried to make sense of them by holding discussions. Eventually, we realized that our discussions were getting very rich and worth publicizing, so we started publicizing parts of them, and eventually we've moved to holding webinars like this one. So we don't just hold webinars like this on theoretical issues, although of course that's a very important part of our work. We also hold webinars on topical issues like what's happening in Ukraine, what was happening in Korea, what is happening in Venezuela, etc. We've had lots and lots of seminars. So we invite you all to please go to the website, read the manifesto if you can. It's now been translated into over a dozen languages, so you can even circulate to people who may not speak English if you like. Consider signing it, consider donating, and consider volunteering. So that's all for now. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Radhika. Gabriel, would you be willing to speak on the Critical Theory Workshop?
Yes, thank you. The Critical Theory Workshop, I founded in 2008 and now collaborate with a number of other people. It's an educational nonprofit, but its real goal is to bring affordable education with real use value to a broad public. We offer a summer program in Paris that also takes place online. We've done a number of online and in-person seminars and workshops. We also have a video archive of many of our activities in the past as a kind of free educational resource. So I can put the link to the webpage in the chat. And if anyone is interested in the upcoming activities, don't hesitate to check them out. We actually have a book launch next week at the People's Forum in New York City, but it will also be online and through the Critical Theory Workshop. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And Alan? on to you for the Geopolitical Economy Research Group.
I think Radhika's actually said everything that needs to be said. I mean, probably the thing that could be added to that is that the Geopolitical Economy Research Group has some sister organizations which are coming together under the umbrella of the Manifesto Group. And another of them is a very important website called newcoldwar.org, which I urge everybody to follow. And this is a blog where we syndicate alternative views from any source on the left that is, gives an alternative to mainstream media. And it's started in Yalta in 2014 in response to what we at the time thought was a new trend in capitalism, fascistization. And I think that was very, very prescient, sadly. So I urge people not only to read it, but to consider writing for it. And please send us our way to our wonderful editor, all the material that you think might be printable on that website. So that's the only thing I'll add.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. So we're now going to go into the Q&A portion of this webinar, this symposium. Please, again, feel free, add in your questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And what we're going to do now is go into questions that have been directed for individuals, and then we'll, after everyone is done, then we'll go through as well the general questions that have been issued. And so just looking at a few of the questions of Gabriel, for your talk around the Frankfurt School, the U.S. state collaboration, there was an ask about some of the literature around this, what exists today. What is the biggest takeaway for communists today? Is it of siding with actually existing socialism, of not buying into U.S. government or industry-sponsored recuperation? And another aspect on the issue of research funding and how this can shape and structure research content. And this is something that hasn't been honestly and fully ventilated. Like the Rockefeller family did, do you think that some contemporary families, businesses, and companies diminish the autonomy of a researcher and or institution? And does that influence research outcomes because they are the funder?
That's a great question. And yes, of course, there's an enormous number of think tanks and very reactionary elements of the capitalist ruling class who are interested in making sure that intellectual production coalesces with their own interests, even if those interests aren't immediately visible on the surface, at least to some people. I would say that one of the elements that helps frame some of the research that I'm doing in the brief presentation I gave on the Frankfurt School is that so many liberals and conservatives approach intellectual production as an individual endeavor, and they only look at individuals isolated from the intellectual apparatus, meaning the actual material system that has them producing particular ideas and circulating those ideas in the broader world. And so drawing our attention to the way in which the capitalist intellectual apparatus functions allows us to see these individual intellectuals as actually products of the system. And I think that's the most interesting level of analysis, because then you don't have to get bogged down in the specificities and the details of their arcane arguments or their discursive pyrotechnics. You can see them as products who are producing for the system what the system wants. And the most important thing is to diagnose that system, understand its historical formations, and a big shout out here to Radhika for really insisting on this, because this goes back to the history of the popular education within the capitalist system. And one of the maybe final elements that I would highlight in this regard is that earlier Marxists often would talk about the relationship between revisionist and anti-revisionist Marxism. At our day and age, and particularly with figures in the Frankfurt School, we're looking at really a kind of reactionary revisionist Marxism that's not even really connected at all even to what the original revisionist Marxists were doing, which was rewriting Marxism to gut it of its revolutionary content. And so seeing all of that as socialists today, I think we can identify its historical roots, but then also tap into the forms of intellectual production that are giving us science and the most powerful tools for social transformation. So looking at what's produced in socialist apparatuses of knowledge production is extremely important, and developing networks for collective intellectual work like we're doing right here with all of the networks that we just talked about is precisely what we need to do in order to build power within the capitalist system to leverage the force of workers in order to oust the parasitic capitalist class.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. So next we're going to go to Summer. And Summer, I know you have to leave in some minutes. And so there were a number of questions that were brought up and a lot of praise for your discussion on how do we understand our work as women under capitalism. And in particular, some of the questions that came up of what does, if you could speak to the People's Commune in China from the 50s and 70s in terms of communal kitchens, of childcare instead of individualized arrangements. I mean, I think some of those aspects too were from, can be seen where they're in the Soviet Union and other socialist experiments. And what are some of the resources that we can use to gain a deeper understanding of social reproduction, especially now? And how do we talk about it with friends and family? How do we make this something that other people can really see?
Sorry, the dogs in my neighborhood want to be on this call really bad. So we're going to have to include them in the background. But I just shared an article from Liberation School written by one of our comrades, Hannah Dickinson, that actually I think probably speaks to your question a lot better than I probably could, because it has an example in there of how social reproduction theory as a framework can be used to guide struggles, not even just like on a state level, but in our communities. So it talks about how in a struggle for water, clean water, free of lead, like in Flint, Michigan, for example, the community was able to understand their situation a lot more deeply and a lot more accurately because of, being guided by a Marxist framework. Of course, there were organizers from the PSL as well there. And so I think that's a really interesting example because it talks about parts of social reproduction that I actually haven't been able to. And I think that kind of tries to start to speak to the question of how can we talk with friends and family about things like this, but also while keeping struggle in mind. Because I think that given just how relatable housework, I guess, and the struggles that people face in their everyday lives, especially in the house, it's so relatable that it's a really good starting point to speak with friends and family about politics, about all the responsibility that the state doesn't take that it so easily actually could. And then I actually don't know that much about China, but in my thesis, I discussed Cuba. And I guess I could speak to that a little bit because just one example is that if you look at their constitution, it's an example of a constitution that really puts the interests and the rights of working class people at the heart of it. And it's one of the only constitutions that has provisions for equitable distribution of housework in it. And there's specifically the family code that talks about the need for men to take equal burden within the household. And that's in their constitution. And I just imagine, how helpful that would be to the people of the United States or the people of India if their government, was on the side of vulnerable people. Yeah, I think I'll just stop there, but thank you for your question. And I think that your question is actually very important because the only way I think to convince people about the possible future when it comes to social reproduction is by giving them examples of China, giving them examples of Cuba, giving them examples of how their states and communities and people right now who are fighting for this and who have already won it and reaping the benefits of these policies. It's not just something in the future that maybe is feasible or not. It's literally happening. So I think studying that is actually very important. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Summer. Summer, you had talked about also of what Engels had described, the historic defeat of women and of the overthrow of mother right, which I think ties in really well with Derek when you were describing about how the past, the present, and the future are all contained in these moments. And of course, there's also the often quoted phrase of that, the history hangs like a nightmare over the past of the living. And something of that we see is that, the past is here with us, affects us, and effects of where we can go from the future. And another piece of, I think there are all so many connections here that are amazing. When Radek was also talking about the influences and impacts that we make today, lay the groundwork for what will come. But Derek, what are some of the steps for communists in the U.S., for socialists in the U.S., for people who want to see a better society, of what does it take to build that movement for socialism? Of how do we take these lessons from history and bring this into our work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this is why Lenin's work on imperialism and national self-determination was so important, because what that did was that linked the struggle for, the working class struggle with the struggle of all oppressed peoples, all colonized peoples, all subjugated and oppressed identities together with one. And so I think that really, in terms of, like, we're living in a world where, well, at least in a country, in the United States and North America, where socialism is more popular than it's been in ever. Even more popular than it was in 2011 with Occupy Wall Street. And so really the task now is not to dismiss those who are interested in socialism, but get their socialism from Bernie Sanders or the Democratic Party or Social Democrats, but to really use that as an opportunity to invite them into a broader conversation about what precisely this means. And part of that entails fighting against the deeply, really one of the two major obstacles to revolutionary struggle in the United States in particular are, racism, the legacy of slavery, and genocide against the indigenous peoples, and also national chauvinism. And those two are deeply, deeply related, because national chauvinism is really a form of racism. And so in order to combat those two things together, we really have to show how Marxism, as a theory, but as a theory that's, really the generalized reflection of the struggles of working class and oppressed peoples globally, that's what Marxism is. It's that theory reflecting on itself. And so we have to show what that theory has done, and how the flexibility and the openness of Marxism as a living and breathing doctrine that isn't a dogma, that isn't universal, that isn't totalizing, why that has been the theory that so many disparate groups have used to not only understand their oppression, but to develop the strategies, the tactics, and the ideologies to overcome those oppressions. And I think it also, really means, mitigating against the sort of academic, after the Soviet Union collapse, the Eastern Bloc socialist countries collapsed, and the international communist movement was so demoralized, people still were struggling and oppressed and facing all these, various kinds of exploitation and oppression in the United States, and they needed to explain it and they wanted to fight it. And so, what theories filled those vacuums? Well, theories from academia and theories that were inherently pessimistic and basically just, focused on how, now, I think Gabriel put it in one of his books I just read, the Radical History in Art and Politics, about this sort of this hypocritical notion that now we're so enlightened that we know that everything, all the hopes of the 20th century, right, were just sort of like bullshit, right? And that's kind of an interesting, like, sort of contradictory statement to make, because how can we be so enlightened to know that, like, we know everything, right? Except, like, including that these things don't work, even though we haven't tried them. So I think, we have to do that obviously in a way that's popular, in a way that's inviting to people, in a way that isn't, I mean, this webinar in particular is not necessarily for, like, sort of everybody. It's for those who are already sort of part of the movement, but we need to be talking to the movement also, because we really need to establish a firm left pole within the people's struggles in the United States. And we can only really do that by clarifying these questions amongst ourselves, by keeping them as open questions, and by raising these questions with the peoples and the masses that we're organizing.
Thank you, Derek. And one aspect from that, when we think about of clarifying that which is just taken for granted or assumed by bourgeois society, by capitalist society, and there was a question around when we speak about capitalist ruling class as well. Of we're referring to, of course, of those who own the factories, the technology, the companies. We actually can see them in the Forbes top 100, where you have 3 people who own as much wealth as half of the world, and that number is always shrinking. It was 8 people, and then it was 5. So who knows where it is now? And Alan, when you were showing again of the graph, and if showing the just blowing out blowing open the light to the rate of growth, and what is the implication of that? Of what does growth mean? Of who does this impact, and what does it mean that this growth is presented as, of course, of the boom is a victory for capitalism, and then the recession, well, no one could have predicted. So there's this aspect. There are a lot of questions about cryptocurrencies, NFTs, and so any thoughts that you can share on that as well, and then also if you could also speak to the relationship between the falling rate of profit and investment in global North and the transition to financial capitalism and the hegemony and ubiquity really of the dollar in the world economy.
That's a lot of questions. I'll try and group all the money questions into one, because this is just incredibly important. Money is the most central social relation under capitalism. It crystallizes all the contradictions of capitalism. And Marx wrote extensively about money, but not only Marx, Keynes also. And one of the things that I tried to emphasize is what's under attack when people attack Marx is actually economic understanding of any kind, including those more limited insights that Keynes had. Now, the central thing here is exactly what I said. Commodities do not exchange against commodities. They don't do CC, they do CMC. Now, M can be anything. It can be a cryptocurrency, it can be a tradable asset, it can be gold, it can be wampum, it can be tobacco, as it was in Virginia, right? The point is, it is functioning as money. So in answer to all those questions, I would simply say these are different forms of money, but the same basic law applies, which is that when the rate of profit gets below a certain level, it becomes more attractive to hold money than to invest in real production. And that's even actually the case when there's no interest receivable on them at all, because then you can have the speculative motive for holding. You just buy commodities to sell them later at a higher price. You keep money to be able to buy things at a lower price later on. So that's a speculative motive. So that's kind of my answer, because money is just a fantastically complicated topic. In fact, my answer is to invite everybody to join the study group to think about it, because there's a lot of empirical work that needs to be done. And Michael Hudson, by the way, is one of the finest sources of information on all of this, knows much more than me. On the question of imperialism, I'm going to deal with that first. In my opinion, I only told half of what I consider to be the true story of the warfare state, which is that imperialism has taken more or less the same form since 1907. I don't think that there's tiny additions to the group of countries which Lenin termed robber barons. South Korea, Singapore. Basically, it's the same group of people, if I could avoid using a derogatory word, have run the world. And what the US did in 1945 was take charge of that. And it said to everybody, we're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to construct buffers against communism. So we're going to go to war in Korea. And we're going to rebuild Korea and the Japanese states. We're not going to do what we did wrong in 1914, which is a Versailles Treaty, trying to bankrupt them. We're going to, on the contrary, build them up, and we have to do that. Actually, the success of Germany and Japan are in many senses a tribute to the revolutionary power of the working class, because the capitalists had to allow them to rebuild, or they would go over to communism. So that was one thing they did, and they said, we'll get a military apparatus which will ensure you're not threatened by communism, including internally as well as externally. And the second thing they did is they set up a system which Radek has documented extensively, in which the US dollar was the key instrument of maintaining imperial dominance and maintaining all the, the dissolute parts of imperialism in what I suppose Kautsky would have called ultra-imperialism, although I don't want to, come out of this being labeled an ultra-imperialist or anything like that. But, one power basically held all the reins, and they're trying to hold on to it. It's wobbling in all directions. But that's the second thing they did. Now, because of the mechanism of transfer of value from the global south to the global north, which is greatly underdocumented, but which is unequal exchange. People like Samir Amin and the theorists of uneven development have explained this at great length. You don't actually find that in Marx himself, because colonialism was there, but imperialism in its current form was not. The economic form of imperialism was perfected in 1890, basically. But I think that what I would say about Marx's value theory is it allows you to explain it. And in particular, it allows you to explain the mechanism of unequal exchange. The vast transfer of value that occurs when the labor of 40 Indian workers exchanges for the labor of one American worker. And if there was a just world, it would exchange against the labor of 40 American workers. This would not result in a massive impoverishment of the working class of America, because the huge gains in productivity that would take place in the global south would mean that they could actually obtain the means of livelihood much more cheaply. So it'd be to their advantage. China's growth is to the advantage of everybody except the small group of monopolists who maintain a monopoly of high-tech goods. An unequal exchange takes place because they have consigned to the global south the role of being suppliers of cheap products, agricultural primaries, and poor and low-paid labor products. So they want to. That's how that works. I've done a lot of stuff on that, and I've put some links to it in my thing, in the link that I gave you. Now on to growth. Well, this gets controversial because we have the whole degrowth literature and so on. Essentially, to put it as briefly as I can, I think what economists call growth is really a rise in productivity. What goes on when the so-called real product increases is that you'll be able to produce more things than you could produce before for the same amount of money. That's what it amounts to. So you can produce more and more things. So when growth slows down, you stop being able to produce more and more things. Okay, now the question is that good? I mean, Vicky Chick and I have written something on speculative thing on secular stagnation, saying it could actually be a good thing if we saw the slowdown in growth as the occasion to undertake a different form of social evolution, green investment, human investment, something I'm very keen on, which is investment in spiritual development through the creative and cultural industries. We would be able to grow in the sense that humans will be able to achieve more, but without consuming more. The problem with growth as it at present stands is it's always the growth of material products. And because of that, it consumes material products. It digs them up out of the earth and brings about the ecological catastrophe. So I think the answer is a transition to green technology. And I do have some issue with the degrowth theorists, which is not, it's a friendly disagreement, but my basic point is, look, we have zero growth now. Capitalism rapes the planet and consumes unsustainably because of production, not because of growth. And growth makes it worse. Of that, there is no doubt. But you won't stop it by stopping growth. You have to stop capitalism. It's, a very trite answer, but that's how I see it. So sorry to take so long.
No, wonderful. Thank you, Alan. Of some of those themes as well have come out of with this unending growth and drive for profits, but also with the aim of imperialism, where we see the U.S. Unilaterally, as in the only one making the decision to impose sanctions, crippling economic warfare on 30 countries, and the impacts of which are felt by hundreds of millions, if not billions of everyday working people, of Radhika, you mentioned of tomorrow, there is another symposium coming up on Eastern Europe, and the devastation of these countries since the collapse of socialism, since the overthrow of the socialist governments, and wherein, as just one example of, in Bulgaria, they lost 40% of their population. That's something that comes through a war, and it has been an economic war that's waged against working people, and of capitalism as a system that wages that war against working people. That's based on exploitation of taking at the expense of our health, Marx writes of capitalism coming into being as dripping with blood and dirt from every pore. And so when we think about, this position as well of Radhika, you mentioned, and so clearly of that, capitalism has been made and can be unmade by social forces. It is a creation within this world. So how do we view this situation, especially in the world crisis today, in the situation today, with the all of this wealth that's been accumulated in the imperialist war? And then there is another question, Radhika, for you on when we look at the split between neoclassical economics and neoclassical political economy. And how does it transform to a neoliberal capitalist order? And also, how do we define neoliberalism? And how do we feel that effects of this split today? And is there a way to come around that?
Right, that's a lot of questions. So I'll try to answer them, but if I miss any, just do remind me. So first of all, if I may just reiterate one thing or underline one thing which I didn't get a chance to mention. Because of the intervention of neoclassical economics in Marxism, because Marxists, rather than fighting it, adopted what Bukharin called a policy of theoretical reconciliation. Of course, we have lost a historical view of Marxism, but and that has many ramifications. And one very important ramification from the point of view of today is that we have most Marxists failed to understand the relation between capitalism and imperialism theoretically. So in the article I just shared, which I've just shared the PDF of, I show, for example, that New Left Review political Marxism seems to essentially take the view that there is no necessary relation between capitalism and imperialism, because they basically eject from their notion of capitalism any notion of contradictions. And it's precisely those contradictions that makes capitalism expansionist. The second thing is that on the other side of the Atlantic, the Monthly Review people, they take imperialism, have historically taken imperialism more seriously, but they have never theoretically reconciled the two, because as I show in this article, Sweezy, who was sort of the intellectual progenitor of this school of thinking, did eventually accept the critique of neoclassical economics towards Marxism, accepting that there was a transformation problem and blah, blah, and so on. So then they essentially tried to reconstruct their own version of Marxism with the slightly vague concept of surplus, etc. So that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, this is directly, so now since we do not understand imperialism, we also do not understand actually existing socialism, because in every case, actually existing socialism has come into being as a result of societies simply saying, basta, enough of capitalism. What capitalism is offering us in this imperialized form of or imperialistic form of capitalism is not acceptable. We need to go somewhere else. So those societies that manage to create, organize themselves sufficiently to say this were able to achieve socialism, while other societies that did not, they suffered the oppressions that continued to occur after the formal end of colonialism, and others resisted partially but not fully, etc. So they registered some development but not fully, etc. So that's the second thing. So, you know, the return of imperialism to Eastern Europe today with the ongoing war there is actually not that surprising. You know, why is it that we have new Cold Wars after the old one was over? Very simple, because the Cold War was a phase in the evolution of imperialism, where imperialism has been declining for the last, I would say, certainly century and more. Let's say take 1914 as the peak of imperialism. Since then, it's been declining. But of course, imperialism does not decline quietly. It fights back every, tooth and nail, every step of the way. Still, overall, the verdict is still in going in the direction, going away from capitalism. But that's one of the things. Now, so we have the return, and what tomorrow's discussion should be really quite interesting. So I've put Alan and I have both put the link in the chat. So please see if you would like to attend or listen to it afterwards, etc. Now, coming back to contradiction. You were asking about neoclassical economics, and somebody talked about neoclassical political economy. I think that was in the question. Let me just make a clarification. It's, when you take economics 101, you are taught the history of economic thought from sort of Adam Smith and even before, like Petty and so on, till today, as though it were a single lineage. What they don't tell you usually is that 1870 constitutes a major break in that lineage. From 1870 onwards, you got a totally different tradition saying totally different things. So you have to understand that Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, these people were all doing something we call today classical political economy. And after 1870, the dominant tradition became neoclassical economics. Now, so classical political economy was historical. It thought in terms of history. It was basically trying to figure out, essentially you can think of it in terms of major intellectuals of the day looking at this new world or a new type of society emerging around them and trying to make sense of it. And they did correctly identify that it revolved around something that was value production, but value production is a strange thing. And it takes a Marx, and it took his Hegelian Bildung, it took his big Hegelian training to really try to make sense of it. So if you understand all these things, so that's a totally different, and Marx through that brought, he reconciled all the conundrums, and antinomies and so on. He made it all work and said, this is how it's working. Coming back to, since then you got neoclassical economics, which is contradiction-free. It says there's no overproduction, there is no underconsumption, there is no profit rate folly. I mean, it doesn't even think about half of these things. So, and Marxist economists have essentially adopted this. So they say, essentially they say there are no contradictions in capitalism, okay, and there are a multitude of contradictions in capitalism. So. So a lot of what passes, by the way, for political economy today also takes neoclassical economics as its core. And in order to reject that and do serious analysis of capitalism, you have to do what I call geopolitical economy. And that involves reaching back to the classical political economy tradition, skirting neoclassical economics, joining up afterwards with the critics of neoclassical economics. Keynes was one, Karl Polanyi was another, Minsky was another. All these people can help. They have important things to contribute so long as you jettison the neoclassical economics. Another quick point, and please tell me to shut up if you think I'm going on for too long, but another quick point I'd like to make is that what is neoliberalism, okay? Now, how do you understand it? Essentially, perhaps one good way, if you think about the Marginalist Revolution, there were three major figures. There was Walras, Alan already talked about Walras, Jevons, and Menger. Walras and Jevons were sort of considered, Walrasian theory lent itself to equilibrium theory, which then was criticized by Keynes, etc. But they also lend themselves to certain reformist thinking. So Pigue's welfare economics could come out of that and so on. The key thread that we have to follow is the Austrian tradition, the one that begins with Menger, because basically what it says is that, look, the outcomes that capitalism delivers may not be perfect. They were not equilibrium theories, but that's all you've got. Anything else is the kiss of death, and they've been fighting and maintaining this position ever since. Now, what you get after the birth of neoclassical economics is you still have generations of people who knew classical political economy. So they do look sort of askance at this. And you had this big Methodenstreit in Germany, between historical economics and the neoclassical economics, and Weber took the side of the latter. Anyway, so it was still sort of emerging from this skin, the old skin of neoclassical Marxism. Then by the early 20th century, by the 1930s, you already have big criticisms of it, like Keynes and Polanyi later and so on. So all of these criticisms are already being mounted. And then, of course, in the post-Second World War period, there was a certain hegemony of Keynesian thinking, even though it was a sort of bastard Keynesianism, as Joan Robinson said. So really, if you think about it, this sort of thinking really comes into its own beginning with the neoliberal era in circa 1980. It is sort of, it's dusted off the shelf, in the 1970s by various think tanks and so on. And then it comes into its own as a policy-making framework. So in some senses, you can say that the world has never seen the results of neoclassical economics in quite the way that we have over the last 40 years. So that's another clarification. And I'm not sure if there was any question that I forgot. I mean, one can say so much about imperialism. Oh, I guess I'll say one more thing, just one other point. And I think Derek, I think it was Derek, maybe it was Gabriel. Anyway, somebody touched on it already. And I think it's a very important point we have to underline. In Capital, what Marx is doing is he is explaining how capital on its own functions. But he never says that there is any society which is a purely capitalist society. All capital comes to prevail. I think it was Derek. Derek said, he used the word prevail. Actually, prevail does mean dominate, but still it may dominate, but it is not complete. So you never have a capitalist system ever. You have the inherited social system. So, in England, you had the inheritance of feudalism. In America, you had the inheritance of slavery and whatever, etc. So in every society, in India, we have the inheritance of caste, blah, blah, and so on. So in every capitalist society, there is a pre-capitalist inheritance. Plus, because capitalism is contradictory, because states and societies have to constantly act to sort of, counteract the worst of the effects of those contradictions. Otherwise, the society would simply vanish. That also creates further layer upon layer of essentially non-capitalist institutions, whether we think of, public education or public health, which are essentially forms of use value production organized on a large scale. You need healthcare, we'll produce healthcare. You need education, we'll produce education. So that is already production for use directly, and it can be made more so. It can, various forms of marketist integuments can be brushed off it. So in that sense, and also, of course, capitalism is not just passively emerging from the pre-capitalist legacy, it also actively uses them. So it uses this legacy of patriarchy, it uses the legacy of racism, it uses the legacy of imperial domination to make its own work easier. And that's partly why the notion of free wage labor also has to be questioned. It's interesting as a heuristic device to understand how capitalism would function if it were left on its own. But every time, every actual working class you look at, you see the marks of misogyny, racism, etc., built right into it. You cannot do class politics without paying attention to all these things. So what is the sum total of all this? There is no pure capitalism. And in fact, there is also a letter by Engels to Conrad Schmidt, I think from 1895 or thereabouts, which says, in fact, that we revolutionaries will never allow it to get to that. We will destroy capitalism well before it dominates the entire society and the entire world. So then one final point, people, this idea that somehow we have to wait for capitalism to mature before we can make socialist revolution, that's complete rubbish. You have to object to the harm it's doing now. And you have to say this is a crazy way of organizing society. It's the most unnatural way of organizing society we could have ever chanced on. It is stupid, etc. So we have to remove it and replace it. Because think about it. When Marx and Engels were saying in 1848, let's make a communist revolution, what were they doing in 1848? Capitalism was barely putting its shoes on in Europe, let alone the rest of the world, let alone getting going. What they were asking to do is what we say in our manifesto. As we put in our manifesto, it was asking working people and everybody else who agreed to smother capitalism in its European cradle. Smother it. This is a monster that has been born. End it now. Let's get on with creating the kind of life that we can have with all the benefits of science, with all the benefits of our understanding of society, etc., etc., etc. So I'll finish there for now.
Thank you, Radhika. And also just to say, when you talk about capitalism as an unnatural system, I think there's so many poignant examples that we can look at right here. Well, I'm based here in the U.S. And when the pandemic began, of course, you saw the complete evaporation of goods, of items from the stores, as people out of desperation were looking to safeguard themselves. And so you had some people who stockpiled a great deal, others who were left with nothing. And meanwhile, the owners of the stores were able to increase the prices as much as they want, to price gouge people who are seeking shelter. In Portland, you had police after the power went out in a grocery store. They had to throw out all of the perishable goods, and police were sent to guard the dumpster, so that poor people could not get a food or orange juice or eggs or whatever sustenance for them to be able to survive. In Texas, you had children freezing to death because of the privatized power grid. So when we talk about the real harm of capitalism, it's right here. And whether it's domestically within a given country, whether it's the warlike and criminal actions of the U.S. government to place military bases in other countries, to weaponize their economy and devalue entire currencies that affect entire populations, where 100,000 people have been killed by U.S. sanctions in Venezuela. Where in Cuba, Cuba is not allowed to purchase medical equipment, breast cancer treatment equipment from other countries because the U.S. says so. And so when we talk about socialism and the real need, it's for human survival. And I think the International Manifesto put it so succinctly, of talking about, previously of the choice was of socialism or barbarism. And today it's socialism or human and planetary annihilation. And in the light of the current situation as well, of when we look to the potential for conflict as we're in this situation, this government that speaks in our name, speaks in the name of the U.S. people, speaks in the name really of the so-called West, is the government where half of its entire population lives in poverty, struggles day to day, and where as well, of Radhika, when you mention of misogyny, of racism, they play a key role for capitalism, because you cannot dispossess the vast majority of the globe without fracturing society into those pieces. And so thank you to everyone who has put in different questions. We are going to give the panelists a chance to make their final closing statements. And so we'll have Gabriel, Derek, Alan, and then Radhika to close us out from this presentation, just with final thoughts and takeaways for people. So Gabriel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patricia, and to all of the other panelists and all of the great questions as well. I think that my biggest takeaway from the conversation that we've had is that the intellectual world war that's waged against Marxism that we see manifest in the social sciences, in economics, in the theory industry, in critical pedagogy, and elsewhere is really a war against the greatest weapon that the working and toiling masses have for global liberation. And that what's at stake is depriving them of that weapon, the scientific weapon of analysis, critique, and social transformation that will aid the project of keeping them working for the global capitalist ruling class. And so part of what I take it that we're doing here is really insisting on the importance of tapping into this deep and extraordinarily rich tradition of what I would call, anti-revisionist Marxism, or the Marxism with the revolutionary core that Lenin insisted on, in order to elucidate, obviously for ourselves, but the point that Derek made earlier really resonated with me, and that is that, ultimately Marxist science is not some type of dogma or intellectual project. It is a reflection of the global socialist movement. And what we are trying to do as committed intellectuals is to provide the most coherent, the most straightforward and comprehensible account of how that rich tradition of research and analysis can be weaponized in the present moment for the liberation of the masses. And as Patricia and others have pointed out as well, in a race against time to keep the biosphere from completely imploding. And so in that regard, it couldn't be more at once important and urgent to plug into and resuscitate this revolutionary core of the greatest weapon of class struggle that they want to deprive us of. So thank you so much for all the other comments, and it's been a great panel to participate in. And I look forward to future collaborations so that we can collectively build up and share more broadly this crucial weapon of class struggle from below.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gabriel. Derek.
Thank you. I mean, Gabriel said it for me. I'll just pass it on to the next comrade. Thank you all so much. It's been a real honor.
Alan?
Just one thing, which is, I don't think anybody mentioned commodity fetishism. Am I wrong about that? Oh, Radhika did, right? Yeah, good, okay. But the reason commodity fetishism is part of this is that the social relations we live in are disguised. And, one of the biggest things that preoccupies me, I'm sure it preoccupies other people, is how can people be so damn stupid? How can the leaders of the free world, the unfree world, engage in such self-destructive, threatening the whole of humanity behavior? It's because they don't see things as they really are. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is they just don't use theory. And the whole point of science and theory is in order to understand how things really work. But also they're prevented from doing that because the commodity form disguises the true human relations that underlie it. Money is absolutely typical in this respect. Money is the disguised form of the relations that all humans have to each other, which are then, Marx wrote extensively about, the God of Mammon and all this kind of thing. Now, how do we overcome that? And in that respect, I think what Gabriel has said is extremely important. And what this seminar is, we can only overcome that through collective endeavor. And we can only overcome that through attempting collectively to arrive at an understanding of what it is that we see. And one of the difficult things we've had in the International Manifesto Group is to explain to people that we are not a party. Our purpose is to facilitate that discussion. Our purpose is not to project a line. And I think I would invite as many people as can to join in the project of having a discussion forum in which you don't have to agree. I mean, I think one of the most important things I always say the left has to learn to disagree. If you look at the literature that was going around in 1920 in Germany, there were 27 workers' dailies, and every one of them had a different line. We have to learn to disagree. And it's part of building a greater future. I wrote to somebody who recently befriended me on Facebook, and she was obviously very isolated. And I said, well, look, thank you for befriending me. We are few, but our children will be many. And, you know, we are here to lay the basis for the new world. And we will do that by creating a world that can understand itself, which is a liberatory project. And I think that was the true liberatory sense, emancipatory sentiment on which Marx and Engels both, you know, launched their life project, dedicated their lives to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. And Radhika, on to you for the last word.
Okay, thank you. I'll make a few points, a handful of points. Very quickly, first on Keynes and Marx, I've shared 3 different writings that I think are quite important. Keynes and Marx were obviously very different people, and I certainly don't think Keynes was as great as Marx intellectually, but he was certainly somebody who, because of the loss of the legacy of Marx through the intervention of neoclassical economics that I described, had to, in a certain sense, reinvent a criticism of capital, and he came very close to Marx in many ways. It's not, you know, one of the problems between of studying the relation between Marx and Keynes is that, of course, Keynesians never read Marx. And Marxists try to show how radical they are by dismissing Keynes. But actually, this is not the way to deal with things. I think you have to understand the situation in which people are. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Keynes and Marx are actually not just similar, they are connected. In these writings, I cite Claudio Sardoni's article, which argues that Keynes considered Marx's distinction between CMC and MCM to be a brilliant distinction. Because, and as you know, money, because MCM begins with money, money is the basis of Keynes's whole understanding of things. And so for Keynes, this was critically important. And apparently, according to Sardoni, Keynes had written an earlier edition of general theory, which was based on this criticism, and then realized, of course, neoclassical economics has changed. Has changed the form of Say's law. As you know, the criticism of Say's law, by talking about a money economy, is central to Marx, and the criticism of Say's law, talking about a money economy, is central to Keynes. Both of these people are worried a lot about money, and if you think that Marx had a commodity theory of money, you know what? If you genuinely think so, throw out all of Marx's books. They are no good. Because if Marx really had a commodity theory of money, he has nothing of importance to say about capital. He did not have a commodity theory of money. That's why he's valuable. So, and a final point about Keynes, I agree. He came from the heart of the establishment. In this sense, he could not have been more different from Marx. But from the perspective of the heart of the establishment, he was witness to the most precipitous decline that any society would have experienced from 1914, the height of Britain's empire, all the way down to facing the prospect of imminent decolonization, destroyed by 2 world wars, strangulated by the United States. Keynes died after essentially suffering from heart attack after negotiations with the Americans over American loans. And Keynes's career spanned precisely this period. His first book was published in 1914, Indian Currency and Finance, which is also about the operation of the gold standard, which tells you how much that had to do with British India and with colonies in general. He dies in 1946, right after the Bretton Woods negotiation. So you can see what a career this was. And because of that, the advice he gave was interesting and relevant to all other countries because he spoke for a radically weakened Britain. And so that's very important to remember. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I said Marx, there is history in Capital. And one of the things I've been doing a lot in a lot of my writings, there's an essay on Hilferding, which if you go to my academia.edu page, you'll probably find it, or you can email me. But Marx, in chapter 27 of volume 3, Marx already anticipates that capitalism is going to enter its monopoly form, and in this form, it's ripe for transition to socialism. But because, and this is already in the late 1880s, he's saying this. Hilferding's analysis confirms this. But the rest of Marxism is so busy either lionizing Marxism or essentially giving up on it theoretically, they don't see that already by early 20th century, capitalism is ripe for socialist transformation. The only reason for the golden age after the 2 world wars and the Great Depression is because monopoly capitalism gets ringed around by socialistic measures that allowed the production of the golden age of capitalism. Without it, that would not happen. And that is why the neoliberal era has been so punishing, because it's pretending that this monopoly structures of capitalism are free market capitalism. Duh. But Marx anticipated it. Hilferding talked about it. There are all sorts of other resources which we can bring to bear on this. Monopoly capital is ripe for transformation into socialism because it's already organizing production on a planned basis. What are big corporations but planned production? The only difference now is we have to take over this planned production and put it under democratic public ownership and authority, not leave it in private hands. What we are suffering from is leaving monopoly capitalism in private hands. So it's there in Marx. Marx does not see capitalism as a static thing. He sees it as evolving. He could already see the end in the 1880s when he wrote Capital Volume 3, or what became Capital Volume 3. And as I say, Hilferding also saw it. So let's go back to Marx. Let's not dilly-dally with these so-called Marxist economics, etc. Marx has everything we need, and I'm not trying to be fundamentalist here. Of course, we have to add to it, and that's why Keynes or Polanyi are important. And they're not all correct, but we can use them to understand where we are today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Radhika. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone who's come, who's asked questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of the questions. Please make sure to tune into the upcoming webinar that is tomorrow. You can find more information on YouTube page and on the websites. And again, thank you to everyone for coming. This concludes our symposium.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Great
you.
work.
And thank you, Patricia, for great sharing.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yes,
Thank you
good
to
job.
everybody. Yeah.